Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live today. I'm so glad to see so many of you with us from different time zones around the world. I thought we would have mostly Europeans at this time, but no, we have viewers from all over the world. Let's see, we have Donna from Iowa. She says it's full of morning sunshine. Lovely to hear that the sun is out there. We have Karen from Italy and May from Norway, Kofi from Africa. So thank you to all of you for tuning in. So glad to see you all joining us. And we love having you here with us for our Facebook Lives. We offer Facebook Lives once or twice a week here at MyHeritage, bringing you experts from all over the industry, whether it be DNA, family history, genealogy, MyHeritage, tools and features. And we love bringing you this great, fantastic content to teach you more about what we have to offer at MyHeritage and about genealogy in general. And we are normally joined by experts from all over the world. And as you can see, our viewers are from all over the world as well. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a very, very special session. We have with us Caroline Gurney, and she'll be speaking about whether or not you're related to royalty. So for those of you who don't know Caroline, she is a qualified professional genealogist with a master's degree in family and local history. She's currently taking her PhD at the University of Bristol, researching their Jewish community in the 18th and 19th centuries. Caroline and her cat Humphrey live beside the sea in Portishead, Somerset. And I would like to bring her onto the screen to say hello to all of us. Let's just bring her out here. Hello, Caroline.
Good afternoon from here to you in Israel. Esther, it's lovely to be with you all.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So we're so glad to have you.
Thank you. I'm gazing with fascination at the number of different places around the world that people are coming from. Thank you to everyone in America, North or South America who got up so early in the morning, and also to those who are staying up late in Australia and New Zealand.
I was going to say, I saw a few Australian viewers, so it must be quite late over there. So tell us a little bit about what we'll be speaking about today.
Okay, my subject today is, are you related to royalty? One of the things I usually do when I give this talk live is to ask for a show of hands if anybody has actually connected their family tree to royalty. I did see one person in the chat, Julie, I think it is, who's connected to the Seymours. There's those Seymours, she says, of Tudor fame. But I'm hoping by the end of this to persuade you that you are all connected to royalty in one way or another. And obviously, because I'm British and because there's a lot of information about the British royal family, this talk is shows examples and based on that. But it's really, what I'm saying is applicable to you wherever in the world you are from. Esther and I were just talking, and she was saying she didn't think that because of her high percentage of Ashkenazi Jewish DNA that she was likely to be related to royalty. I said, you're almost certainly descended from King David or King Solomon. And that will be true for those of you from Africa or, from the Pacific Islands. It doesn't matter where. But I hope to persuade you all of that by the end of the session.
Incredible. And before we get to the session, I just want to let everyone know about a giveaway that we have for today. And we'll be giving away a MyHeritage Complete Plan to one lucky viewer at the end of today's show. So all that you have to do to enter is either put a question or a comment for Caroline in the comments section, or you can let us know about a fascinating family history discovery that you've made using MyHeritage in the comments. Just put it in the comment section throughout this session, and at the end, after the questions today, we'll be giving away a MyHeritage Complete Plan. And for those of you who don't know, the Complete Plan at MyHeritage is the best plan that we have to offer, with unlimited access to 13 billion historical records, unlimited family tree size, and access to all of our photo tools. So we hope to see those comments about your incredible family history discoveries that you've made using MyHeritage in the comments section. And also feel free to questions in the comments for Caroline throughout the session. So should we bring up your slides now?
Okie doke, here we go.
Okay, let me just bring them into the screen here.
Can you see that, Esther?
Perfect, we're good to go.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, welcome again, everybody. I'm delighted to be back on Facebook Live with My Heritage. They're always such great sessions. Because you'll probably know from worldwide news that we sadly lost the Queen's husband, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, on Friday. And because my subject is about royalty, Esther and I thought it would be nice if I was to begin by just saying a little bit in tribute to the Duke, and particularly in relation to family history. I think a lot of people have been surprised to discover from the tributes and obituaries that have been published that, in fact, Prince Philip was quite a close cousin of the Queen. They were both descended from Queen Victoria. This is from an old copy of the Illustrated London News. When they announced their engagement, the paper published this little chart showing the descent. And I was interested to read in one obituary the phrase, "The Duke was keenly aware of his family history," because not only was he descended from Queen Victoria, he was also descended from King George II of England, of the United Kingdom, I should say, through a different line from his descent through Queen Victoria. And he was descended from Tsar Nicholas I of Russia and King Christian IX of Denmark. In fact, the complications of this tree are such that I couldn't make it any larger and get it on the slide, but there's King George II, his daughter Princess Mary, and that line leads down to Christian IX of Denmark. And then over here you can see that the linking factor is the family, the Dukes of Hesse in Germany, because they intermarried, including with Tsar Alexander II. And here we have Nicholas II, the Romanov Tsar who was killed in 1918, the last Tsar, and his wife was Princess Alex of Hesse. Her sister was Princess Victoria of Hesse, so Alex's niece was Princess Alice of Battenberg, who was the mother of Prince Philip. So Prince Philip had these connections to so many different branches of European royalty. And I'm sure you've all read that he had a great sense of humor. He was once asked in the 1960s during the Cold War if he would like to visit Russia, and he said he would, except that they'd killed half his family. Well, roll forward to 1993, and bodies had been discovered about 2 years before in Yekaterinburg, and there was a suspicion that these were probably the bodies of the Tsar, his wife, and their children. And because of Prince Philip's descent through a maternal line, just a bit of DNA here, Queen Victoria's mitochondrial DNA went to her daughter, Princess Alice. Princess Alice passed it to her two daughters, and therefore the Tsarina and her children would all have had that mitochondrial DNA, and Princess Victoria passed it to her daughter, Princess Alice, who would have passed it to Prince Philip. So Prince Philip willingly gave his DNA, and through that they were able to establish the close link, and that the bodies of the children and their mother were definitely those of the Tsar, the Tsarina and her children, and therefore probably the other body was that of the Tsar. So he made a vital contribution to family history, to royal family history, and to the advancement of DNA studies as well, right back in 1993. So, okay, you're looking at this family tree and you're thinking, well, that doesn't look anything like mine. There's no way that I fit in anywhere into these intermarrying royal houses of Europe. And as I said at the beginning, I'm hoping to persuade you that maybe that's not necessarily the case. I'm going to look at this subject in two directions, going up and going down. Going up will be starting with you and your family tree and working backwards. Going down, we'll be looking at some notable kings and their descendants. And as I say, I'm using the British royal family, but please take what I'm saying and read it across to whichever royal family is reigning or used to reign in your particular part of the world. So let's start with going up your family tree. I often ask how many of us have known royal ancestors. It was interesting to see a few popping up in the chat just now, but I guess for most of you, it seems, excuse me, oh, I've got a touch of hay fever. It's pollen season here, and I thought I was going to sneeze, and then it went away again. So apologies if there's a sneeze. Most of us probably, though, feel that we're nowhere near this kind of mythical family tree that was produced in medieval Europe. Rather more of us think our family tree looks like this. Our ancestors either worked on the land, or perhaps they were in domestic service, this picture of the lady in the middle, or maybe they were in some kind of manual occupation. This, I think, is a post boy from 19th century London. And when we look at our family trees, this is pretty much what we're looking at. If you've been studying your family history for a long time, and if you've been lucky, you may have managed to get back through your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, to your great-great-grandfathers and mothers along this line here. And there are 16 of them. Now, I know many very competent genealogists who haven't been able to get all 16 of those great-great-grandparents. There's all sorts of reasons why you might not be able to do so, particularly if they come from somewhere where records have been lost. It's extremely unusual to find someone who's managed to go back another generation and do all 32. And after that, the next generation is 64. And I'd be interested to see if anyone wants to put in the chat whether they've managed to go back and get 64 ancestors in that line. But for most of us, we tend to get stuck, and we maybe pursue one or two of those lines, even 3 or 4 of them, but others just start petering out. Now, as a result of that, we don't really appreciate how many ancestors we have. I produced this chart starting with the first generation, assuming a birth date of 1950, which may be a bit old for a lot of you on this today. It's even older than me, but it was just at the time I did this a useful starting point. Okay, so obviously the first generation there, 1950. Back to 1920, this is quite a conservative estimate that a generation is 30 years. There would have been times in the past when it was a lot narrower than that. And again, in different cultures, it might be 25 years average between generations or even 20. But assuming a conservative average or generation of 30 years, so your parents are born around 1920, that's 2 ancestors. Going back, and it seems pretty slow at first, doesn't it? This is why you're having trouble probably getting all 64 ancestors back at generation 7, because for someone born in 1950, that's born around 1770. And as you go backwards, you'll see that the numbers slowly but surely are getting up into quite high figures. By the time you get back to the year 1500, you've got 32,768 ancestors. And you may think, hang on, that can't be right. But if you want to check take a screenshot of this, and if you want to check my maths, do so, because these figures are correct. Now, look what happens because of this doubling that's happening. Look what happens when you get back less than 100 years before to the year 1410. You've got 262,000 plus ancestors. And the numbers just get ridiculously huge. By the time you go back 30 generations for a person born in 1950 with 30 years per generation, the numbers are 536, nearly 537 million ancestors. So this is what is known as exponential growth. It grows proportionately. And you can see the way the graph absolutely takes off after about 9 generations and goes practically vertical. We're all kind of used to these graphs, unfortunately, from the past year plus of the epidemic, of the pandemic. What is really interesting when you consider that number of ancestors is to look at it against the population. Now, because I'm looking at the UK, I've done this, in fact, I've done this against the population of England. I've tried to assume an English person looking at against the population of England. That's simply because the figures are pretty reliable for England because survival of records is so good, whereas in some other countries it'd be really hard to do this. So you look at the year 1800, you've only got 32 ancestors there around that generation against nearly 8 million population. And that, you're unlikely to be with the royals there, are you? Go back even to the year 1600, you've got about 2,000 ancestors against a population of 4 million. So yeah, you could still be all agricultural labourers. But go back another 200 years, from 1600 to 1400, and that's over 10% of the population. Population of just over 2 million, you've got 262,000 plus ancestors. By the year 1300, only 100 years earlier, your ancestors, 2 million of them, are half the population. And then by 1200, you've overtaken it, and actually your number of ancestors is 10 times the population of England. So if you're English and watching this today, that would be the situation, taking your ancestors back to the year 1200. And then if we go further back even, we can actually start to look at it against the population of the entire world as it's been estimated for those years. In 1100, you're coming up close to the population of the entire world. By the year 1000, that's just over 1,000 years now back from us, we're looking at 2 billion plus ancestors against a worldwide population of 275 million. So what can we take from this? Well, obviously, there is no way that you could have had 2 billion ancestors when the world population was only 275 million. Indeed, there was no way that you had 33 million ancestors when if you were British or English and the population was only 3 million. What had happened? And this is what had happened. It's a concept known as pedigree collapse. We don't typically see it because we don't get far enough back our family trees. So what we tend to see when we draw up our trees is I can't really do this without doing a kind of demonstration. You see a V shape of the branches of the tree coming out and out and out like this. They're getting wider and wider, and each line is getting wider. What we don't tend to see is the point where it starts to narrow back down again, and that's what pedigree collapse is. I've actually only found it once so far in my own family history. This is my ancestor Elizabeth Snelling, born at the end of the 18th century. Her parents were James Snelling and Elizabeth Toop. And what I didn't know until I'd done a lot more research was, in fact, that they were both descended from the same couple, James Cates and Mary Newman, by two sisters, Margaret Cates and Mary Cates. This was in quite a rural part of Dorset. Well, all of Dorset is rural, more or less, but a place where there was quite a lot of intermarriage. And so this has come up, and you can see how the two lines in green, go down to Elizabeth Snelling. And that means that she doesn't have the same number of ancestors in this generation as she ought to have, or you'd expect her to have. Now, an even more extreme example of pedigree collapse is the poor, unfortunate King Charles II of Spain. This is his family tree, and this is a picture of him. If you get time to study this, again, take a screenshot so you can look at it later, you will see that there were two incidences here and here, three incidences also here, of uncles marrying nieces. And there were also, I think, 4 instances of first cousins marrying. Here we get, William of Bavaria and Renata of Lorraine, and then again, Ferdinand II and Maria Anna of Bavaria. And here, Maria Anna of Spain and Ferdinand III. You can just imagine what that did to the genetic pool. And as a result, that was how Charles II turned out. The poor unfortunate man had a tongue that was way too big for his mouth. It stopped him speaking properly. It stopped him breathing properly. He had all sorts of other genetic complications and wasn't able to father children. And as a result, that Spanish line died out with Charles II and led to the War of Spanish Succession. But this is an extreme example of what we've in fact all got in our family trees. It's just with Charles, it happens over only a few generations. You can see that it starts going out and then it comes back in again, and he's basically got a diamond shape. And this is true for all of us and has to be true just when we look at the sheer numbers of ancestors per generation and the population figures. So that's going up. Now let's look at going down again. Here's a rather nice illustration of the descendants of King Henry VII for 4 generations in the House of Tudor, to which the lady who's got the Seymour ancestors is connected, Julie. One of the things we have to bear in mind that actually was that the chances of royalty passing on their genes and their having children who survived and then themselves lived to have children and so on down the generations was much better than it was for peasants. And we've all heard about, the low rates of life expectancy, which were estimated to be between 35 and 40 before the year 1800, at least in the in UK. Probably true elsewhere in Europe as well. Now, that didn't mean, as some people seem to think, that everybody died between the ages of 35 and 40. As genealogists, we know better. We know that there could have been somebody who died at the age of 80, averaged out against somebody who died in infancy. And that's how the short life expectancy figures are derived, because there was extremely high infant mortality. Again, these are estimates, but it looks like at least 40% of the population never lived long enough to produce children themselves. And even those who did live long enough into adulthood to marry had to contend with all the different unpleasantnesses of life in former centuries, be it poverty, sickness, congenital illnesses of various kinds, pandemics, the fact they were often not properly nourished. And of course, if there was war or violence of any kind, the peasantry were the ones who tended to get killed, whereas the royals and the nobles might very well be captured and ransomed. So their chances of producing generation after generation of descendants were much worse than those of royalty, because their genes were rampant. And if you want to find out more, here's a book for you. Here are some of my favourites. Starting with Charles II, he was known in England as the Merry Monarch. He was restored to the throne after the English Civil War, and he once said that he never intended to go on his travels again, having spent a long time in exile in France. And the whole mood after the Puritan rule during the Civil War and the Commonwealth period was one of excess, I guess, somewhat like the 1920s after the horrors of the First World War. And Charles II led the way. He had at least 13 mistresses that we know of and produced 20 illegitimate children. Ironically, he didn't produce any children by his legitimate wife in order to inherit the throne, and he was succeeded by his brother James II. Now, because this is so recently in time, talking the second half of the 17th century, very few of us are likely to be descended from Charles II, because our pedigrees haven't yet collapsed enough to be linking in to noble and royal lines. And these 3 people that I've shown here, which is the late Princess Diana, Samantha Cameron, who was the wife of our former Prime Minister David Cameron, and the lady who's popularly known throughout the world as Fergie, Sarah Ferguson, who was the Duchess of York, the wife of Prince Andrew. These three all come from posh backgrounds. Princess Diana, of course, from a noble background, and Samantha Cameron and Sarah Ferguson came from well-established English county families. And those are the sorts of people you're probably likely to find as descendants, as someone, a king as recent as Charles II. But go back 300 years to Edward III. Edward III had 13 legitimate children. As a result, we endured the Wars of the Roses between the competing rivalries of various of the descendants of his children. But it does mean that he had an enormous number of descendants because of those rampant royal genes and the fact that royalty and nobility were much more likely to survive and reproduce than the poorer people. We know of, to the last time I checked this figure, it was 300,000 documented descendants, proven genealogical descents from Edward III. But it's estimated that for all those 300,000 that were documented, there's probably about 100 million or more worldwide who are descended from Edward III. And this is where we see it moving worldwide. Here I've happened to show Americans, but we've got Michael Douglas, Barack Obama, and Captain Jack Sparrow, because I've completely forgotten the actor's name, but you'll all put it in the chat for me. Johnny Depp has come back. Okay, one of the reasons for this is that almost anybody in North America who has early colonial ancestry in New England will find themselves with a royal descent. And those royal descents are often the easiest to track. That's because there was a sort of a population bottleneck, if you like, a relatively small number of people coming out from England in the early 17th century to the first English colonies in North America. And they tended to come from a certain status in English society. A lot of them were prosperous tradesmen or yeoman class, or even younger sons possibly of the landed gentry. They were people for whom religion was important, and therefore generally people who were literate and educated. And so they tended to come from higher up the social scale. And so you'll find that with those early colonial arrivals, almost all of them come from the class of society which will lead you back, if you can trace them, to a noble and then a royal ancestry. Now, if we go back another 300 years, this is one of my favourite quotes. A chronicler who was a great fan of Henry I, King Henry I of England, in all solemnness wrote that he was completely free from fleshly lusts. And he explained away his 6 known mistresses and 22 illegitimate children by saying that with only 2 wives, not at the same time in succession, and only 2 legitimate children from those marriages, Henry was worried about the succession and the continuation of his royal line, and therefore he had these other children as a sort of insurance policy. Well, from them we get these 3 figures. Some may be known to you, others not. On the left is Tony Benn, who was a British socialist politician, and I don't think would have been too happy to have been descended from Henry I had he known. Viggo Mortensen, he's half American. He was Aragorn in Lord of the Rings films. He was half American and he's half Danish. So even here, we've got someone, for a lot of his ancestry is from Denmark, but he's descended from Henry I. And of course, Bill Gates. And finally, if we go back to the Emperor Charlemagne, who lived between 742 and 814 AD, and who was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, he was the documented ancestor of every king of France since the year 936, every king or queen of England since 1066, the Norman Conquest, and every monarch of Scotland since 1097. So if you can find your link back into any of these royal families, you will find your way back to Charlemagne. And of course, if you have a connection with other royal families in Europe, in Spain or in Germany, the various German princely states, in Russia, you will find yourself linking in because of the intermarriage between royal families. Because despite what we're often told in our history lessons, there was actually a great deal of social mobility. Having spent 36 years now researching British genealogy, I can tell you there's an enormous amount of movement between the different social classes and between different groups with different levels of wealth in the population, and often extremely quickly. In my own family, I have an example of a will being disputed in the early 17th, sorry, beg your pardon, in the early 18th century. And because they had to trace descendants of everybody who might inherit, they discovered that one of the grandsons of a person who had been prosperous English gentry, just below the nobility, was now a coachman in London. In 2 generations that had happened. But even in countries where we think that the social structure was much more hierarchical than in England or Scotland, and I'm thinking of pre-revolutionary France here, where there was one of the main causes of the revolution was that with the lack of social mobility. Even there, Voltaire remarked that slippered feet could be heard going down the stairs as the hobnailed boots ascend them, which I think is a lovely description of what's happening. And the reason this happened was obviously because, particularly with those kings or who had 13 children or more, not all of them could necessarily be found or want another royal marriage with someone at the same sort of royal status as themselves. And particularly the younger children, some of them would marry it usually tended to be the sons of kings would marry the daughters of the higher nobility. But then those noble families in turn, if they had a large number of children, you might find that one of the younger children of a noble family would marry someone who maybe, say a daughter would marry someone who was a knight rather than actually have a higher title of nobility. If you carry that down through enough generations, you quite quickly come down the social scale. At the same time, there were always people making money, accruing wealth, seeking to improve their social standing by marrying up. And even if they themselves weren't able to do it, very often they could give their children the education and the polish to do it in the next generation. And there's some particular moments in English history where that was very common. One was in Tudor times, in the middle of the 16th century, with the dissolution of the monasteries. Quite a lot of people from the City of London who'd made their fortune in trade were able to buy landed estates because there was so much land being freed up and resold, and to establish themselves as gentry in a particular rural area. And it happened again in the 19th century with industrialists, and indeed with wealthy immigrants as well, or those who came as immigrants and became wealthy. They married into the landed gentry, indeed into the nobility. So it wasn't uncommon to have a situation of prince to pauper and back again. And I'd like to illustrate that with 2 of these descents. For Prince George of Cambridge, for anyone who doesn't know, is the oldest son of Prince William, and who is the Duke of Cambridge, and his wife, the former Catherine Middleton, now the Duchess of Cambridge. Prince William is the son of Prince Charles, who is the Prince of Wales and the heir to the throne in the United Kingdom after the present Queen. Now, you can see that he's descended here from Edward III. And obviously I can't put in all the generations, an awful lot of them, but these are the ones I think that stand out for me. After 100 years, we're still in the higher nobility. We've got a descendant here of Edward III. He's Henry Percy, 3rd Earl of Northumberland. That was a really, really important earldom in the 15th century. His daughter, Lady Mary Percy, though, doesn't marry another noble or even a baronet. She marries plain Sir William Gascoigne. So their child, Anne Gascoigne, doesn't have a title at all. She manages to marry another knight, Sir Thomas Fairfax. But if we come down another 100 or so years, we find that we've got Benjamin Fairfax, direct descendant of Sir Thomas Fairfax, but by this stage he's just a curate. That's not even the person in charge of a parish. He's the clergyman who's number 2. Now, what's interesting is at this date, to become a curate, to have been in what they called holy orders, would have meant he had to be educated enough to have gone to Oxford or Cambridge to have taken his degree. That was a requirement of becoming a clergyman. Yet his own son was only a draper. And you've moved a whole class there from the gentry, albeit minor, down into the mercantile shopkeeping class. Well, by the time you get down to 1949 and Kate Middleton's father being born, Michael, his career was as a flight attendant. And so Kate herself, although she went to a posh school and met Prince William at St Andrews University, didn't come from a hugely prosperous background around this stage of the 20th century. But on the next slide, we can see that Prince George has another descent from royalty, this time from the King Edward IV, and through his grandmother, Carol Goldsmith, rather than through his grandfather, Michael Middleton. And this is an example of how rapidly a family could go downhill. We go from King Edward IV, died in 1483, to his descendant, Sir Thomas Blakiston Conyers, who, although he was a knight, still had a title, actually ended his days in 1810 as a pauper. Within 7 years of Sir Thomas Blakiston Conyers' death, his grandson, Anthony Liddell, was born in 1817, and he was a coal miner. So, and it's well known that Carol Goldsmith, herself descended from Anthony Liddell, was born in a council house and from a very a family with had very little money. So this just shows you how Prince George obviously has got royal relatives on his father's side, but he's also got them. And the reason we know this is because when Kate Middleton it was clear that she was going to marry Prince William, people started digging into her family history in a way which they probably wouldn't do for yours, and that's how they found these connections. There's 3 other ways in which proof has been brought of how everybody really has royal blood. First one is through direct genealogical research. A man called Mark Humphreys, based in Ireland, has a website which includes a section on royal descents of famous people, because he became interested in this because he started noticing that whenever there was a reliable family tree for a European, not just a European person, but a person who had European ancestry, so that includes a large number of people in North and South America, in Australia, New Zealand, etc. Whenever he looked, there was a reliable tree, they all turned out to be descended from English royalty. And he said even such unlikely people as Hermann Goering and Daniel Boone. And the reason was because all you need is one person with that royal English ancestry to marry somebody and live in a different country, and if their descendants survive, you're going to have that brought into the genealogical pool. And it's well worth looking at his website. He's been running it from 1995 to the present day, and he has pages, I think it's now 200 pages of provable descents, going back all the way to Charlemagne. And it just might be that you'll find somewhere in there a link with one of your own lines. Now, the work that he's done has been backed up by computerized mathematical modeling. The 2 leading figures in this, Douglas Roeder and Joseph Chang, did their work in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And sadly, I haven't been able to find much updating of it in the 20-odd years since. I hope somebody will take this up. But they're quite sophisticated computer modeling which use very conservative estimates about how far people travelled for a spouse. They kept people more tied to their small locality than probably was what really happened in practice. But even doing that and having, again, a 30-year generation, which would have been too long for some stages of human history, they made the astonishing discovery that the most recent common ancestor of all living humans today probably lived around 3000 BC, and that the most recent common ancestor of all Europeans lived as recently as 1000 AD. So that's after the time of Charlemagne. And it seems astonishing. And you start thinking, well, what about the very isolated tribes, people on the Andaman Islands or Tasmania, for example, which was cut off from contact from Australia, they say, for many thousands of years. What this is talking about is people who are living today. And because in almost all those cases of isolated groupings, they have since been contacted and there's been an admixture, that means we're related to them. Often that admixture doesn't show up in our DNA because our genetic ancestors aren't the same as our genealogical ancestors. So Esther was telling me that most of her DNA is Ashkenazi Jewish, but there may well be other genealogical ancestors who weren't Ashkenazi Jewish. But because the vast bulk of her DNA is that, their genetic signature hasn't come down to her. And this has been shown by work on DNA analysis with the same goal as the computerized modeling. These two biologists at the University of California, Peter Ralph and Graham Coop, published a paper in Biology back in 2013, The Geography of Recent Genetic Ancestry Across Europe. They looked at DNA results for people from Ireland right across to Turkey. And they were looking for common or shared long stretches of genome. And they were astonished to discover how many of these stretches of genome were shared between people at the opposite ends of Europe. So much so that they reckoned that over the past 3,000 years, and you remember the figure of 3,000 years for a worldwide common ancestor, they found that over the past 3,000 years, they had literally hundreds of different common genetic ancestors. But of course, as I've just explained, genetic ancestors are only a tiny fraction of our genealogical ancestors. We don't inherit DNA equally from every ancestor. I've been part of a group of cousins at fourth cousin level testing for DNA, and it's quite interesting how we all match with some of the group, but none of us match with all of the group, and yet we're all descended from the same people and related at the same distance. So they estimate that for genealogical ancestors, people from the opposite ends of Europe share millions of common genealogical ancestors over the last 1,000 years. And if you remember the population figures back to 1,000 years ago, those millions are more than the population of their countries. So from this and from the other work that's been done, it's been deduced that everyone who left descendants 1,000 years ago is an ancestor of every present-day European. That all Europeans are genealogically related over very short time periods. And that, in fact, there is a close genealogical kinship of individuals across the world. And I actually love this because it proves that there really isn't, despite what so many wicked people have said and done in the past towards people who they thought were of a different race from them, there really isn't any difference between us. We're all descended from the same people and we're all cousins. So, are you related to royalty? All of our family trees are diamond-shaped. We all share common ancestry. It's estimated that if you're British, you're probably no more than a 15th cousin from anybody else who's British. That Europeans are no more than 25th cousins, and that all humans are 50th cousins of each other. And those, again, are conservative estimates. It could well be less. And so the answer is that some of us are provably descended from Charlemagne, and the rest of us are probably descended from Charlemagne. So armed with that, why don't you go to MyHeritage and start looking about whether you can find the links between you and the royals? They've got a wonderful selection of books published in the late 19th and earlier than that, through the 19th and into the 20th century, which cover subjects like peerage, baronetage, the knightage of the United Kingdom, directory of titled persons, pedigrees of knights. And that's what you need, because what you're wanting to do is work your family tree back to a family that's possibly a mercantile family, a little better off than those around them, and then from them back to finding these links to pedigrees of knights or titled persons. I have not yet been able to achieve this myself. My best chance of it is in Scotland, where I'm traced back several lines to the 16th century, who I'm pretty sure are connected to people of the same name who did have a title and were descended from kings and queens of Scotland. Unfortunately, my bit of the family was always just off the side of the printed pedigree. And until I can spend weeks researching in Scotland, I'm not sure I'm ever going to be able to make that connection. But hopefully you will find an easier route for yours. And two of the books I thought were particularly helpful were The Plantagenet Roll of the Blood Royal, which gives all the descendants they then knew of Edward III. And it'd be interesting to match that up with the online source that Mark Humphreys has got. And the other is this Wolfords County Families, because it says it's a royal manual of the titled and untitled aristocracy. So it will include people who don't any longer or didn't any longer have a title, but nonetheless were descended from the nobility. So I wish you happy hunting, and I think Esther and I will both be fascinated to hear if you manage to make that royal breakthrough. And I just leave you with this disparate collection of people who are actually all descended from English royalty and are all cousins, therefore. As you saw with Barack Obama, same with Halle Berry, the so-called race, the colour of your skin makes no difference. And the wide variety goes from Oscar Wilde to Margaret Thatcher, the Empress Josephine, Charles Darwin, Baron von Richthofen, the Red Baron, famous flying ace of the First World War, Jane Austen, Lord Nelson, Humphrey Bogart. Oh, and that is Alice Liddell, who was the model for Alice in Wonderland. I'll leave you to recognise the rest. And so if you've got any questions, I'll hand you back over to Esther.
Thank you, Caroline. So insightful. And we just received so many amazing comments here as you were speaking. So I'll just read out a couple of them before we get to the questions. I see Julie said, "We are truly a global family." Love it.
Yes.
And let's see, Susan says, "I have made a leap in research linking my family name to the same family in France, expelled and dispersed with the Huguenots." Let's see, Donna said, "I'm so excited. I just made a connection with a third cousin in Denmark, and I live in Iowa, only through my heritage DNA." Incredible. And Julie said, "These statistics are amazing." Those statistics really were eye-opening at the beginning.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I went back with my calculator when I was making that table. I checked it and I checked it and I checked it again. I mean, it's not difficult rather to multiply by 2, but as the numbers started to get so large, I couldn't believe it. And I think it's because we just don't, most of us don't get the chance to take our families back far enough to see this kind of thing happening. And it's really mind-blowing, isn't it? It changes your view of the world, I think. I love giving this talk because I just love the fact that we're all cousins. It doesn't matter what we look like or where we come from. We're all so closely related to each other.
It's really incredible. And I know there were a lot of comments here from viewers who said, will this be available to rewatch if they missed it, or they want to go back to those statistics or any part of the class. So it is available on the MyHeritage Facebook page, facebook.com/myheritage under the videos section. So feel free to go if you missed any of it, or you just want to rewatch any part of today's fantastic session. Feel free to go back and catch that. I see Deb said, Esther, this was absolutely an amazing session. It was eye-opening today. Loved it. Thank you so much,
that's so sweet.
Deb.
Thank you. I will, when I get a chance, I'll go through your questions, and if there's a specific topic there. That's the nice thing about doing it this way, because it's there for posterity on Facebook, and you can go back and answer. So I noticed someone asked about how closely Charles and Diana were related. One thing I forgot to say about Prince Philip, actually, on that slide with his European royalty, he was actually more royal than the Queen.
Oh, wow.
She had more royal ancestry than the Queen, because half her ancestry, because her mother was from Scottish nobility, only half her ancestry was immediately royal, whereas all of Philip's was.
I actually, correct me if I'm wrong, I heard that his Prince Philip's, his mother, Queen Victoria, was present when he was born, when she was born, I believe.
It was either his, I think it might have been his grandmother, but one of them.
His grandmother.
Yes. I think it was his mother, because he was born in 1921, so his mother would have been born before Queen Victoria died in 1901. Yeah, because there was a lovely thing about some snooty courtier at the palace saying to him when he was engaged to the then Princess Elizabeth, I'm sure you'll come to love Windsor Castle when you get used to it. And he said, I'm sure I shall. My mother was born here. Put that person in their place.
So if it's okay with you, Caroline, we'll take just a couple questions from the audience that we've collected. Sure. Let's see. Troy asks, how many pedigree collapses can one have?
Well, you must have thousands, millions of you, mustn't you? Because otherwise you've got those ridiculously large number of ancestors that you can't possibly have had. So, I mean, our problem is simply having the records to show that you've got them. But once they start coming in, I imagine they come in thick and fast. And when you think about the various bottlenecks in history as well, which meant that lots of people died off. I'm thinking about the Black Death in 14th century Europe. I mean, the population, I don't know if you noticed when I showed that slide with the population, it actually went, it was going backwards, and then there's that big dip because of the Black Death. So that then the previous year before that, there was actually a higher population, there's a blip. Large numbers of people were lost. So then you've got it narrowing down. So there you've got people who are going to be the ancestors of a lot more. I mean, obviously, we're not all descended from everybody who ever lived, because a lot of people who ever lived never had children, or didn't have children whose lines survived, or grandchildren whose lines survived. But what we get, therefore, with these bottlenecks and narrowings and pedigree collapse is that when you get far enough back, everybody alive today who has got is descendants of everybody who was alive then and had descendants down to the present day. And of course, it's still happening. You don't know, but you might be a person who has an amazing number of descendants, and give it another 1,000 years and you could be the ancestor of everybody alive, which is mind-blowing.
So make sure to record your family history today.
Exactly. So I mean, it just is fascinating the way and again, I think our DNA, we're so fixed on DNA at the moment, we forget that genetic ancestors aren't genealogical ancestors. They're just a small subset of them. So yes, I mean, I'm excited to, if you're American, you probably found pedigree collapse quite quickly because of that bottleneck of the early immigration. For me, with quite a widespread British ancestry, I've only found the one so far. But that just means I haven't got far enough back.
Which leads me actually to our next question from Joan. I guess maybe that's part of the explanation, but you can answer for us. She asks, why does it seem easier for Americans to be able to trace their families so much farther back than for most British researchers?
Yeah, interesting. I think that probably is, as I said, because it's a self-selecting population that came in the 17th century. And although obviously a lot of people are descended from much later, more recent immigrants, and maybe from elsewhere in Europe, and almost certainly from elsewhere in Europe, or from very poor people in Ireland or Scotland, for example, because of intermarriage, you go down a couple more generations and there's someone with that colonial ancestry in New England. So that makes it easier. It's that bottleneck in the 17th century. We didn't have that bottleneck. So we need to go back probably to the 15th or 14th to get the same kind of effect.
Understood. And just so many fantastic comments here in the comment section about discoveries that some of our viewers have made, or connections to royal blood. So I'll just read a couple of them out before we award our complete plan to one lucky winner. Just so many. I see that Joan says, I found that we are related to Theodore Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. My family members don't really believe it, even though I've shown them the link and explained that it's not that strange.
It isn't. We're all related to famous people for the same reasons. We're all related to royalty. And I mean, doesn't that get proved? I think there's a Roots Tech app where when you're at the show, they tell you who at the show, if you've got a family search tree, they tell you who at the show is also related to you. And I know Sylvia Valentine's in the audience here. She seemed to come up with loads of people that she's found at Roots Tech. So, we're all cousins. We just don't know it.
And you can show them this presentation and see what they have to say after. After they see the first few slides, maybe they'll be convinced. So now we would like to give away a complete plan to one lucky viewer who sent us a comment in the comment section. So firstly, thank you to everyone who wrote in, and we loved seeing all your comments and questions. Thank you so much. As we said, we'll be giving away a complete plan, which is the best plan that we have to offer here at MyHeritage, with unlimited access to 13 billion historical records, unlimited family tree size, as well as complete free access to our photo tools on MyHeritage. So photo tools on MyHeritage that includes Deep Nostalgia, which we recently released, which lets you animate family photos. I see Caroline smiling. Have you tried it out?
Yes.
And have you seen your ancestors moving around a little?
Yes, it's a bit creepy, I think, in some ways. I mean, it's amazing that you can do it. And I saw a lovely one that was posted on Twitter of a little girl, someone's wife as a little girl. And that was
yes.
so lovely.
Yes.
But it worked. Yeah. I've tried it with quite a few, including my people I knew who have since passed away.
Yeah, there are some incredible examples, and of course you have to just find the right photo that fits. So definitely check that out to everyone if you haven't. In addition to our other photo tools, that's MyHeritage in Color, the MyHeritage Photo Enhancer. So a lot of things to try out in terms of our photo tools, which will be free to this lucky winner with the complete plan in MyHeritage. And we are going to give it away to Sharon Anderson. And Sharon wrote to us today and she said, through DNA testing, I am amazed at how many people I am related to in America, Norway, Denmark, Ireland, and England. And I live in Australia. So thank you, Sharon, and we love seeing that too, just how DNA and genealogy, family history, and I'm sure Caroline agrees, how it just brings us all together.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
So Caroline, thank you so much for joining us today. What a fantastic session and so much fun.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you all, and I will try to answer questions.
Fantastic. Thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us today, and we hope that you have a great day. Bye.
Bye.